So
Awesome.
how's it going? You are listening to Born Optimistic, a very special guest on the show this week, Luke Howard from Melbourne. Luke, how's it going?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Yep.
Now, Luke, we'll talk about your career in detail in a minute, but I have to ask you, where do you sit on the optimism spectrum?
You mean in terms of music or in terms of general life kind of
As a way of life, yeah.
oh,
Like
I am pretty optimistic. I mean, that's because there's this whole it feels like there's almost a kind of sad club with this genre of music that I sit in, and I joke about it a bit. Like, in fact, I use the term sad piano a bit, but it's very tongue in cheek. And I noticed someone uh, created a sad piano playlist the other day, and I was like, that that is supposed to be completely tongue in cheek, but I'm very optimistic. I'm a little cynical about things, but that's just kind of my way of you know getting through the disappointments, the occasional disappointments of the arts industry.
and were you always optimistic or was this something you learned as you grew?
Oh, I think kids start off optimistic. I think becoming an adult's what makes you less optimistic. So I feel I was way more optimistic as a child. I'm trying to I try to keep as close to that as possible. But I guess sometimes sometimes it can be hard to keep the that unflailing enthusiasm for things.
And it's funny, you call the music the sad piano music. It's very emotional. The music you make, like what brought you to that? I mean, we'll go way back in a sec, but
Well, I mean, it's like one of my friends says she likes to make music that makes people cry, which is again pretty tongue in cheek. But I think one thing I share with her is that I want to make music that tells a story and that elicits some reaction in the listener. That's like an emotional response. It doesn't have to be too sentimental. In fact, if anything, I strive to not kind of um, go too much into the sentimental side, to kind of sit on the a delicate balance between having an emotive sort of narrative and not going too far into cheese land. But yeah, look, I want people to feel things because that's kind of what draws me to music as well. I want those moments where you're like, you have, whether it's doesn't have to be sadness. I mean, actually, one of the things about this kind of music is that if it is melancholy, it's usually coupled with some kind of hope or optimism as well, right? I certainly don't intend to depress people, but that to me that's what's interesting. It's not that I'm not interested in music that's static or that doesn't have a kind of emotional narrative, but I think what I'm drawn towards is that kind of music, and it probably stems from the music I grew up listening to, like particularly people like Keith Jarrett, and Pat Metheny, a lot of those jazz guys uh, that were pretty melodic and a little bit on the feel on the emotional side, but still had a kind of strong structure and thoughtfulness behind their music.
and how do you hope people are affected by engage with you? Let's say coming to a gig, you're going to be playing the Unitarian with James Heather at the end of March. Like, how do you want people to be different at the end of your set than at the start of your set, or do you have a set way you want people to feel?
Not at all. I think I definitely believe that music's for every person to take in as they wish on the moment of the gig. And I know from my own like gig attending that sometimes can be the best music in the world, and I'm just, for whatever reason, I can't engage with it, or because of what's happened that day, or other times the music's the perfect balm to what's happened that day. So I have no expectation except that I mean, it's great when people do shut up and listen. I mean, that's definitely that's nice. I don't like playing gigs when people are talking, but beyond that, it's really up to everyone. And you get different reactions, and it depends on their, as they're saying, like how they're feeling, whether they've heard your music before and they're engaging as a kind of repeat listener, and also just the way they like their taste in music and all that sort of stuff. But usually it seems that people at least the people that bother coming up to you at the end of the gig are have had a rewarding experience.
They're into it. And would you go so far as to say as your concerts are a respite, a break from the world for the audience?
Yeah, perhaps less so for me, but yeah, I think so. I mean, it's one of the funny things is that like I'm a pretty caffeinated, anxious person, and yet the music I make is not like that. Um, but perhaps it does take a lot of that for me to get to that point. But yeah, it is. I mean, this is it's like all things that are cliche. There's a bit of truth in it. The world is busy and full of interruptions, and it's only becoming more so. Uh, and also, I guess we're in an increasingly secular society where there are less kind of rituals and places where people come together, opportunities for people to come together. So concerts, I think, are a way for that kind of stuff to happen. But yeah, I mean, my perspective as a performer perhaps is a bit different because I kind of have to work hard to create hard to create that space as opposed to participating as a listener.
And you don't have like choruses and whoops and hollers to fall back on.
No, although I did do a gig in London a couple of years ago where I started playing a piece. I mean, I'm always impressed that anyone comes to my shows, let alone anyone that's heard any of my music. I started playing one piece, and there was like a whoop of recognition in the crowd, and this was like there were also quite a few drunk people. It was quite funny because the music was as we were discussing, quite peaceful, but and the audience were very quiet and respectful. But uh, in between the tunes, they were quite rowdy, and it was really cool because it was nice to have that kind of engagement with them rather than sometimes you play a show and everyone's deathly silent, and you wonder like they're either really bored or they're deeply engaged with it, and you won't know until the end of the gig.
And why the piano? What attracted you to the piano for the first time?
Well, it was approximately 35 years ago that I started playing, so memory is a bit hazy on that regard. And neither of my parents are musicians, so I don't know what really I don't know what encouraged them to encourage me, apart from the fact that they tried to get me interested in a lot of things, and most of them, like sport, didn't stick, but somehow the piano did. And also, I mean, I tried a bunch of other instruments at high school, but I either wasn't really any good at them or never gave it the time. So, yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, it's the piano. It is one of those instruments that everyone can play a little of, right? But it's also very. I mean, you can go very deep with it too, and it's also it's a it's a huge palette of sounds to explore, and I think maybe I don't know, like how much to analyze it. Is it because I'm an only child and a control freak that I want to be able to make all of the sounds at once by myself? I don't know. I don't know, but I think the short answer is that I got dragged along to piano lessons, and I didn't stop for a while, and then by that time was too late.
At what age were you 35 years ago?
I was 5 or 4.5, so maybe it's 36 years. Hang on a second. I think I started playing in 1983, so I don't know. My maths is terrible.
That's super, super, super young.
Yeah, I was 5, I think 4.5 or 5. But yeah, I mean, I imagine I wasn't very good when I started, but you know, it's not hard to be the best piano player at school. It gets a bit harder when you get into as the pond gets bigger. Not that well, by the time the pond gets big enough, you realize it's not about being the best. It's about being different and unique and having something to say rather than being able to fly around the keyboard. Although I wish I could fly around the keyboard.
And so there was never a plan B. Like this was always what were you going to devote your life to once you started?
Oh no, I had a plan B, and in fact, at some point, after high school, I wasn't really sure if I would go back to Plan A, which the music thing. I spent a lot of time, in fact, most of my 20s, sitting in front of a computer churning out code. I had like well, still have to some extent, a parallel career as a software developer, and did a lot of a lot of fun things. Worked for Apple in the States as an intern when I was 19, and on what became Mac OS 10, and done
Yeah.
a lot of a lot of fun stuff. But at some point, I decided, it's pretty much impossible to do two demanding things. Two things that to do really well require 120% of your time. I mean, you'll die trying. So I kind of had to make a choice, and eventually I chose music.
Wow, it's you're so prolific. That's the thing. Just looking at the list upon list upon list of stuff you worked on, and James, who you're sharing a bill with, has only come out as a piano player recently. He kept it secret. I don't know if
Yeah,
you know.
I know he's told me. I mean, I think, look, one thing is if you do keep doing stuff over a long period of time, I mean, you will have a catalog of music because you get older, and unless you remove it. I mean, I definitely have dropped a few things that I did. Like the first records I made are pretty hard to find, but that stuff will that stuff will collect, and hopefully as your audience grows, there will be that back catalog that you can share with them. But I guess I mean, it's a classic freelance thing. If I don't keep working and trying to make stuff, I'd probably just stop and get lazy because, fundamentally all humans are lazy. And I don't think I'm actually one of those people for whom I would die if I stopped writing music. I mean, it's a really important part of my life, but it's, there are other things that I like, software that I'd also enjoy. So in a way, producing music constantly is part of that kind of, keeping the ball rolling and keeping myself curious about the world, the musical world, and challenged. That's why I like to make things.
Yeah, what does keep you zinging? Like, is there a Tao? Is there a philosophy attached to what you're trying to do? What is it that you're looking for?
Look, really, for me, it's just about being curious about music and the world. I know making the same record. I mean, obviously, there's some, you know, conceptual themes that run through my records, which is an artifact of, well, hopefully not short-sightedness or laziness, but simply the fact that you're when you have a musical identity, it's kind of hard to suppress it entirely, if you don't have one, that's maybe not such a good thing. But I'm always trying to make a record that's not exactly like the last one. Otherwise, what's the point? So for me, particularly as someone that didn't study composition formally, my music background's much more as a jazz pianist and much more as a performer than a composer. I feel that I'm just learning. I'm just at the bottom of the mountain, trying to like understand the last few hundred years of classical music and learning one bit at a time. And it often takes a while for ideas, things that you study, to manifest themselves in your own output. So I think my only philosophy is staying curious and also trying to find what excites you about music, the way you're excited the very first time you heard something, because that can totally get harder as you're saturated with things, and you also become more aware of the devices that composers use to elicit, to convey certain emotional narratives. If you get too clued into those things, then the magic can be destroyed a bit. But you also need to know about them so you can use it. So there's always a delicate balance of ignorance and understanding.
Yeah, you seem to have. I don't mean this in a bad way. You seem to deliberately want to keep things vague
It,
in that area.
in what sense? In like in judge on the output or like on
In terms of what you're trying to elicit and the responses you're
yeah.
trying to elicit.
Well, I don't. I mean, I'm not a massive fan. Like, I feel with instrumental music, it's it's so abstract. It's like dance, right? I mean, what does it mean? If it means anything, it's because it might trigger a memory related to some other musical experience or something. I don't know if I necessarily believe a minor chord is sad and a major chord is happy, because it's completely possible to elicit the opposite reactions with those chords as well. Um, and then also, like, I find that if a piece of music if it does start from something really personal, then I probably don't want to share it with the audience. And then if it starts from something abstract and impersonal, then I don't want to spoil the listener's opportunity to engage with it by telling them that it was just something you know, I noodled in a sound check and recorded on my phone or something. um,
There must be something very grounding about being a classical pianist from Australia.
yes. In what?
Well, as in
Explain more.
Australian society will probably only let you go so far up yourself.
Yes. Well, that's the classic. Yeah, the old cultural cringe, which is the source of many discussions. That's true. I mean, I would say this kind of music that is enjoying a kind of a moment in, particularly in Europe, in the last 10 years, has not reached the same audience in Australia, with the exception of the more well known people like Niels and Oliver. But even then, those guys mostly within the context of a festival or something where it's a real event that's promoted to an audience that might otherwise not engage with classical music. So yeah, I feel that's kind of cool. I mean, in a way, I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm certainly not saying Australia's a cultural wasteland, but and hopefully no one from home hears this. But I reckon that it's kind of cool to make music in an environment which is not saturating you with that kind of music, because you can create your own world and space in your head to think about it. And I kind of like that compared to moving to Berlin, which, I mean, I have lived there like everyone else, and that's kind of where most people who make this kind of music seem to live. But I kind of want to be isolated a bit, and I sort of want my friends to not really, know the ins and outs of everything, or still assume that I'm the jazz musician that's available for a wedding gig on Saturday night.
Or for you to have to defend your latest work over a cup of coffee when you're hungover.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I think yeah, I think I like being a bit isolated in that sense. The audience I really feel is in Europe, and Australia's kind of like my hideout for working on things away from the audience. And maybe I'm just making a little, yeah, philosophizing a bit too much, but then there's a sort of an idea of somewhere to incubate things, and then you present them when they're ready, and those maybe the physical isolation kind of helps. I don't know.
And there's no loneliness there.
No, I mean, most of I quit having only musicians as friends like about 10 or 15 years ago. So, like, most of my social kind of infrastructure is people that are not, they might be creative, but they're not in the music world. So, I feel that's a healthy thing. And then conversely, they're great musicians in Melbourne, both in terms of orchestras and also people that I grew up playing with. So, I feel that, when you need to step outside of your own studio to engage other people to play and stuff, then everyone's there and they're all on your doorstep. But they might engage differently because that's more of a kind of come over and play something, and they don't need to buy into the whole vision. They just need to play the dots on the page, and then you can weave that into your own sort of emotional narrative or whatever, in your own time.
You just had all that crazy heat in Australia. Are people really freaked out?
Well, I mean, the world and Australia has been getting hotter for the at least since I remember it, since as a kid. So, yeah, it's not much. It's 40 degrees days aren't much fun. Yeah, it's just when there are a few of them in a row. But the thing about Melbourne is that there'll be a day like that, and then the next day it'll be like 15 or something. So it's usually not too bad, notwithstanding bushfires, of course, which is a real issue for many, particularly as people live, suburbia is kind of extended out into the bush, and people from the city are surprised when they realise that these places are actually designed to burn from time to time.
Yeah, part of the natural cycle.
Yeah, but you don't want to be part of it.
So it's actually a bit of a respite for you. So coming to the well, not relative. It's pretty cool here at the moment,
Yeah,
temperature
not as
wise.
bad as I'd heard though. I mean, certainly, London's been sunny and quite crisp. I mean, I'm kind of into it actually. I think I expect it was going to be like minus 10 or something, and I'm not really. I don't own the clothes to deal with that, so it's been pretty. pretty pleasant, pretty spring-like.
Now, personally, I've been into technology for quite a long time, but I feel myself growing a little bit wary of it in the last year, year and a half, and I don't think I'm alone. As someone who knows how to code and is really intimate with technology, what's your take on how things are at the moment?
Well, it's. I mean, I'm the worst person for like constantly checking Instagram and all that stuff. I feel that the general thing is like, and I'm not certainly not the first person to make this comment, is that we have created a bit of a monster, and it's a monster that's been created by a particular demographic that work in Silicon Valley and that are motivated mostly. And I totally appreciate this motivation because I've also been, maybe not to the same extent, but I've also felt the same thing of, because it's the idea that because it can be done, it should be done, and you build the technology first and deal with the kind of social um, repercussions later. Uh, and and also it comes from the scientists kind of approach, right? That problems are there to be discovered and solved, and if you don't do it, someone else will. So let's get to it. But I feel that when it gets to the point that it's changing society so quickly and even changing the way the brain works, I guess maybe I'm a Luddite. I mean, there's always going to be that argument, but I feel that it is changing social structures in a way that the people that created the tech didn't anticipate. And the best example of that, right, is like Steve Jobs not letting his kids have an iPad or whatever. It's like, it seems like all the guys in tech know that they've created a monster and they don't want their kids to be engaging with it too early. But meanwhile, everyone else is, kids are swiping pieces of paper as if they were touch screens. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it also depends. Do you want to like just let the experiment run and wait ourselves, allow ourselves to assimilate into the Borg until we're pretty much brains in test tubes, or do you want to maintain some of the social kind of infrastructure that we have today, where just hang out with people?
Oh yeah, well, I think the whole world, well, definitely Europe has definitely gone. Technology is not the solution to everything, and there is a pushback for sure.
Yeah, Europe's good like that. I mean, you see that in the kind of not political, the regulatory kind of stuff as well, like GDPR and finding companies and those. It's just so different to America, and Australia kind of sits somewhere between the two kind of extremes, I think. But yeah, I guess we'll see what happens. But yeah, I mean, philosophically, I think or socially, I feel I'm more in the European camp, but then also, I can understand that technology for technology's sake is irresistible to the entrepreneur and the engineer.
So you were in the middle of all that world, age 19, as you say, working in Apple. Steve Jobs
Yeah,
was
I
still
mean,
alive.
yeah, and look, I mean, I'm probably making the story sound better than I was, but it is a touchstone, I guess, because everyone's heard of Apple, although they certainly hadn't. They certainly weren't as popular in the late '90s, but uh, and I was only there for a few months, although I did continue to contract on and off for the next few years. But yeah, look, it's a long story, which I won't bore you with, but it was a lot of fun and it was a great time, and there's some very smart people there, and because it was a lot smaller a company too, I think there was a lot more of an opportunity for a lowly intern that is a pretty average programmer at that age to have a lot far reaching an impact than you might now when it's a much larger company with a lot more process. So it's probably some of the most fun I've ever had, actually, was that internship.
What did you learn from your time in Apple?
Uh, well, when you're surrounded by people that are 10 times smarter than you, or at least 10 times more experienced, then you can osmosize things a lot, really quickly. So for me, that was like studying computer science in a kind of flat, freeze dried form. Um, but also one thing, obviously you learn about working in teams and delivering things that align with other people's schedules, and the stuff that you don't really do if you're a kind of lone programmer. But I think, you know what, I mean, maybe it wasn't the wisest business decision to go back and study music or start my own company, which is what I ended up doing. But I kind of also realized that I do like solving problems that I can define, and I don't mind doing. And I kind of like working by myself in a very sort of limited way of interfacing with the outside world, because that kind of complete autonomy lets me treat software with the same creativity that I can with music, and that was more important to me than being an engineer in a big company or trying to climb up to be a manager or those sort of things. For me, the
And did you start a software company to solve a particular problem?
I did, and the problems are extremely obscure. I'm not. I'm not. I'm not. I'm not going to bother trying to
Go
explain
on,
them.
give us the elevator pitch.
Oh, it's all to do with kind of network infrastructure, and as my ex girlfriend said, you spend like 5 years of your life just so you could log onto your computer. It's like complete waste of time. But it was all in the infrastructure sort of world, the kind of stuff which unfortunately is hard to explain to people because most of the time you don't see it, and when it breaks, you do see it, and then people don't like you. So, um, but
And of course, all this brings us back to the fact that at your gig in the Unitarian, and I assume your whole tour, you're playing grand piano, but augmented by a laptop.
yeah, and I mean, for me, the laptop, it's sometimes I do wonder about whether lugging a laptop and also a 25-kilo suitcase up up flights of stairs in Airbnbs is really worth it. But yeah, the short answer. Well, firstly, I mean, music and software, like the electronic side of music, is not something that really engages the programming brain in me. I've never gone down that path. It's really I'm just another punter with a copy of Ableton Live. But like for me, it's a way of creating some dynamic, a textural and dynamic story that is hard to do with the piano itself. And I feel that helps, you know, say something that engages the audience and also recreate some of the textures and ideas that are on the record. A lot of my records have strings, and I know James is playing with a quartet for this gig, but it's just the numbers just don't stack up to tour with a string quartet, or let alone an ensemble that's as large as what's on my last record. So really, it's a way of trying to find some way to deliver those textures live, and the laptop is one way of doing it. But I'm thinking that it's gonna at some point I want to ditch it and just go back to piano, both for the health of my back, but also because there's something really nice about an unamplified, completely unamplified concert with a piano, and just setting yourself that challenge of trying to tell a story with those tools alone. Because obviously, the less tools you have, the deeper you have to go into the instrument and the ideas to communicate the same kind of things.
Absolutely. Well, have you been to Dublin before?
No, I haven't. It's always been on my list to go to Ireland.
Oh my God.
Because I mean, usually what happens is I fly into or out of the UK because Qantas, that's pretty much the only place they fly in Europe. Uh, and and then I always been thinking, well, I'll go to Ireland on the end of a trip. Then I never end up doing it. So I'm really excited. I met a bunch of Irish musicians at one time at jazz camp some years ago, and I was impressed by the folk music tradition and this real kind of sense that music was something you did socially rather than professionally, and that music came to these people I met with an ease that I haven't seen. It certainly is not. That thing doesn't really exist in Australia.
We'll have to bring you to see some traditional Irish music. So while you're here,
Yeah, I would love to. I think I will be there for a few days actually, so I'd love to. I mean, all those and also that really, those harmonies and that very kind of uh, I mean, it's the intervallic structure, and that sort of stuff. I think it also has a lot in common with like choral and church music too. But that stuff somehow is really kind of in my musical language, the folky stuff. I don't know where it came from, whether it came from my teachers or a sort of Irish piano teacher at one point, but or whether it came from growing up hearing kind of singing hymns and that sort of stuff. But that particular musical language is really kind of stuck in my vocabulary. So I'm keen to get a bit closer to it.
I love traditional Irish music, and there's few things as amazing as a session when it kicks in and the musicians lock in, and it's like levitation.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just
totally.
incredible.
Yeah, that's the feeling. Actually, you know what? I mean, that's one thing I do miss about the jazz world. I don't know if when I last had a levitating experience, but playing solo, which, as I said, it's kind of the thing that's the easiest thing to tour. But yeah, not interacting with other musicians. That's and or when I do and I write for orchestra or something, then the notes are all on the page. So that kind of levitating feeling that you get from people that are improvising doesn't happen as easily. So yeah, I think that's something that I really miss about music is that kind of I know exactly what you mean, the levitating feeling.
And trad has its own rules and codes and ethics and principles that are so, it's such a self-regulating organism, the whole thing, where everyone gets to do their own thing,
Yeah.
but we're all respecting the same tradition, but not in an authoritative way.
Hmm.
It's really fabulous. As well as this Born Optimistic podcast, I also produce another podcast called Trad Fest, which is all about trad and folk.
Oh, lovely. Let me check it
So
out.
check that out. And there's so much amazing, amazing trad and folk music in Ireland, and I love it. I love it dearly. It's incredible music.
I think the folk song that comes to mind is Newry Town. I remember playing that with some friends when I was at this jazz camp, and I remember.
It's been great chatting to you. Can't wait for the gig, March 23rd. It's going to be great. You've been listening to Born Optimistic. Thanks a million until next week. Bye.
Bye.